You lay on your belly. Lay on your belly.
Yes, sir. Okay, sir. Okay.
Good evening, Black people and all allies fighting for Black liberation, Black prosperity, and Black joy. I'm Charles Blow, and this is Prime. Ronald Greene was on I-20 in or near North Louisiana town of Morial when he encountered state troopers in 2019. He would not survive that encounter. I know I-20 in North Louisiana well. It links so many of the places that helped to form me. It runs through Shreveport, where I was born, and the place where I met my ex-wife and where we got married. East of that, it runs along the southern edge of Minden, where my mother took us to buy school clothes each year, the same city where my brother now lives and he teaches at the high school. East of Minden, I-20 passes about a mile north of the fly-speck town where I grew up. It's called Gibbsland, named after an enslaver named Gibbs. Much of the land had been his plantation, so it was literally Gibbs land. East of that, the highway scrapes across the top of Arcadia. It was the parish seat. It was the place with the closest library, the place where I saw my first movie, and the place where I acquired my driver's license. East of Arcadia, I-20 passes along the northern edge of Grambling, home of Grambling State University, where I went to college and studied mass communications and became co-editor of the Gramblinite, the school's newspaper. It's basically where I became a journalist. And east of that, the highway bisects the city of Monroe, where my friends and I often went to parties while we were in college and where my nephew lived with his mother, and it is where Greene was killed. All of these cities and towns are majority Black, and their administration, including policing, reflect that to some degree. These spaces always felt special to me, at least in the relationship between municipal power and the people. But in between those safe spaces, along I-20, the Louisiana State Police reigned. The feeling they gave, at least to me, was not one of safety. Part of the problem is a lack of diversity. As the Advocate newspaper in Baton Rouge reported in 2018, although 32% of Louisiana's population was Black at the time, only 16% of the state troopers were. On Saturday, the Advocate reported about Troop F, the Monroe-based division at the center of the Greene case. Quote, of the 66 Troop F members, just 6 were Black, records show. The area they patrol is about 40% African American. The Troop F roster is 86% white and just 9% Black. The connective tissue between these majority Black cities and the towns that dot I-20 in northern Louisiana is being patrolled and policed by an overwhelmingly white force, unattached to them and unresponsive to them. You can read more on my column, White Troopers Policing Black Bodies, at nytimes.com, but joining me now to discuss the racial disparities between Louisiana state troopers and the communities are 2 former mayors of Los Angeles, Mitch Landrieu and Marc Morial. Mayors, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hey, good to be with you, Charles. That's New Orleans, Charles.
So, Mayor Morial, I'll start with you. So, what explains this disparity and why there's so little diversity in the ranks of the state troopers?
Let me say, Charles, first, thank you for having me. Good to be on with Mayor Mitch Landrieu, my good friend. Charles, it's quite frankly an outrage that this lack of diversity exists at this moment in time with the Louisiana State Police. Its roots are in the long history of slavery, then segregation, then discrimination and institutional racism. But also, it's important that this is a problem that can easily be fixed. There are an abundance of highly qualified Black men and women with law enforcement backgrounds in city police departments and federal law enforcement who would make great state troopers. This is institutional racism, 21st century style in my beloved home state of Louisiana. And I'll say this because I know we'll get to it. The death of Ronald Greene is an absolute outrage. The tape turned my stomach. And I'll have more to say later this week when I meet with a group of activists and others, and we speak out publicly on the case. The case had it seemed to have gone away. COVID had intervened. But when anyone sees that tape, what they witness is a absolute torture and a lynching. And it's unacceptable, and we can't be quiet.
So, Mayor Landrieu, I mean, the diversity of this force is abysmal, yet diversity itself doesn't seem to always fix the problem. As both of you guys know, the city of New Orleans had its own issues with policing, particularly of black people, and was on a consent decree for a while. I'm not sure if it's still under a consent decree, but a local station there did an analysis of stops just last year and found that 3 out of 4 of all stops were of black people, and their assessment was that things had actually gotten worse on racial bias, not better. So how do we put into context this idea of the state troopers lacking diversity, but diversity also not being the panacea?
Well, first of all, let's start with Ronald Greene. I agree with Mayor Morial. There was nothing right about that stop. First of all, the use of force was inappropriate, and it was just not justified under any circumstance. Then they wrote a report that wasn't true. Then they covered it up. And now there's a systemic problem with how they're actually responding to it. I know we're going to talk about that more later, but I think it's appropriate to start there. Now, I served as lieutenant governor for 6 years, and I had 2 state troopers who actually secured me as a lieutenant governor. And it is true that there are some good people that are in that force. But I subsequently became the mayor of the city of New Orleans, Charles. And as you said, the day that I became mayor of the city of New Orleans, I invited the Justice Department to come. They were coming anyway, but I wanted to make sure they knew that they were welcome. And we went through a fairly exhaustive consent decree process. And notwithstanding the fact that we still have problems, one of the things that we began to realize that how you hire, how you train, how you supervise, whether people are wearing body cameras, what level of accountability, what level of accountability there's going to be after something happens, all of those things are critically important. Now, from that perspective, I was also able to witness the state police when they came into the city to help us with crowd control. And you could see that they were not trained nearly as well as the police officers through the consent decree training as we were. And as you noticed, and the most poignant thing about your piece, although it was all of it is well written, is this notion that somehow you can have these towns that dot I-20, which are majority African-American, where maybe the mayor's African-American, maybe the DA's African-American, maybe the police chief is African-American, but all of a sudden on the highways in between, it's actually run by a police force that doesn't look anything like the community, and because of politics, is not accountable to those individuals, and therefore doesn't need to be repaired as quickly as possible. You can see from the Ronald Greene case that we have a systemic problem with the state police, not just in diversity, but training as well, and supervision, accountability, and then the cover-up. All of those things have got to be changed from soup to nuts in order to make the streets of Louisiana and America safe for African Americans.
Mayor Morial, on that, I mean, part of the reason that this happens, you know, largely the municipal South is majority black. The big cities, to the large degree in the South, are majority black. 1,200 majority black cities in America, 90% of them in the South. But part of that is because what white flight did, particularly in the South, but also all over the country, is that people moved out of cities into sometimes unincorporated zones, into exurbs. And so the state troopers helped to become their police force, right? And so the city is left with a separate, you know, more diverse, more black police force. And so these police forces are basically patrolling and policing different people for different purposes. How do you fix that?
Well, let me say this. The question you asked earlier, and that is diversity the answer? Diversity alone is not the answer when it comes to policing. There's got to be a systemic overhaul and a completely different philosophy and approach. We've got to reimagine and re-envision policing in America. It is true that in the South, white residents fled many of the cities of the South, New Orleans and Memphis and Atlanta, Baton Rouge, just to name a few, Birmingham, really to flee integration and school desegregation. That was indeed the impulse. And that instinct created tension and hostility between mostly white suburban residents and mostly black urban residents. And it created this impression, and it was a false narrative that cities were the repositories of all things bad and suburbs are the repositories of all things good. It was a false narrative, and the narrative played into the notion that you needed these tough, brute policing to somehow protect suburban residents from the threat of African American urban residents. Racism has many forms. One of its forms is false narratives. One of its forms is the creation of fear. One of its norms is the elevation of division and tension. And I think that legacy haunts much of the South today, where you could see in a city or in a state like Louisiana, where many of the major urban communities are led by African American mayors and have majority African American political leaders. Yet in the legislature, you have a legislature which is shifted very far to the right. In fact, further to the right than it was when I served in the legislature in the early 1990s. Mayor Landrieu was a member of the legislature at the same time. The legislature shifted farther to the right, and the cities are now more predominantly African American than they ever been before. This division, this political tension, it ought not be, but it is, and it's a hardcore reality of life in a place like Louisiana.
And let me add to that, if I might, because Marc and I were in the legislature together, and this is true, and it's worth noting. Most of the major events that we're talking about, George Floyd, et cetera, have taken place, for example, in major metropolitan areas like Minneapolis and New Orleans and Atlanta. But if you just take a minute and say about counties, and then in Louisiana we have parishes, as you know, and you think about all the police forces that there are in little bitty cities and in counties that are run by sheriffs, they don't have body cameras. They don't have consent decrees looking at their hiring, supervision, and training. And so what we really have to do, as Marc said earlier, is really reimagine police, really from top to bottom. Go through the systemic design of how the police departments are designed, what they're supposed to do, and really focus on hiring, training, supervision, accountability, transparency, and making sure that we completely change the relationship between the police and the community. That's what people in America want, black and white, because these incidences that have occurred, this inhumanity that has occurred with Ronald Greene, this happened actually right around, and maybe even a little bit before George Floyd. Nobody knew about it. Nobody heard about it. This is an outrage for the state of Louisiana. I'm embarrassed by what it is that I saw much, and the pain that you feel. The other night I was on this show, and Mr. Greene's mother was on the show. And Charles, you know this, and Marc, you know this. A mother's pain can't be any deeper than losing a child, much less watching your son treated like that. And it doesn't really matter, Charles. You made this point in your article. No matter what Ronald Greene did, he didn't deserve a death sentence. You've seen police officers around the country take somebody that was just involved as a mass shooter and walk them away more casually and more comfortably than the way they treated Ronald Greene. There's no excuse for that. And that's just because they were not trained appropriately. There needs to be accountability, there needs to be transparency, and there has to be a complete retraining all the way up and down, not only in that force, but in the forces in every police department in Louisiana and across the South, maybe in the nation as well.
Mitch Landrieu, Marc Morial, thank you, mayors, for your time. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Always.
Thank you. Nice to see you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Charles.
Thank you.
Good, Mr. Mayor. Yep.